Hi folks, Jacob Whitmer here. I thought I'd take a moment and discuss with you a certain subject that I feel needs addressing. Recently, the Beatles released their studio catalog on digital music streaming, on pretty much all of them. Spotify, Apple Music, Tidal, Rhapsody, Verizon Fios. And so I decided that this would be a good time to talk to you about a sort of hobby that I've had for the past 6 years now, which really says a lot about my life, that I've been doing this silliness for 6 years. Let's talk about the Beatles. Now, I think it's pretty well established that I myself am a major fan of the Beatles catalog. I still believe that they're the greatest rock band, if not the greatest music creation of all time. They changed all the rules of pop music, and they still have a power to their stuff that can be felt even today, with them constantly influencing countless generations of artists and performers. But we are not talking about their 60s heyday, we're talking about a certain different little side era. In the years between 1963 and 1970, the Beatles put out 13 studio albums, which are still regarded as some of the finest work ever produced by an artist. Finally culminating in the album Abbey Road, released in 1969, this was their grand finale. And yet, I have a love-hate relationship with this album, because while I admit it's pristine, almost a perfect album, there's always something about this that makes me just go, what if? Because even with Abbey Road being their final recorded album, it's still an album of firsts. It's the first time that synthesizers were used on a Beatles record. It's the first time they had upgraded to real 8-track recording as opposed to the 4 tracks that they used pretty much throughout the rest of their recorded career. And it's the first time George Harrison got a real spotlight as a songwriter, contributing the 2 probable best songs on the album, being Something and Here Comes the Sun, both of which are some of the most beloved songs in the entire Beatles catalog, let alone just the 2 highlights on a fantastic album. So this always made me wonder, what could have happened had they decided not to split? What new sounds and new territories could they have explored if they had gone on into the 1970s and the 80s and 90s, and what would they have even done to adapt to today's modern pop culture? So I soon discovered that I was not alone in this either. Apparently many other Beatles fans have wondered about this too. It even culminated to the point where Ethan Hawke referenced this in the movie Boyhood.
I call that Beatles Blackout. All right, what it is best of John, Paul, George, and Ringo solo post-breakup. You know, when you ever listen to too much of the solo stuff, it kind of becomes a drag, you know? But you put them next to each other, right? And they start to elevate each other. And then you can hear it. It's the Beatles.
But we were there first before you, Ethan Hawke, and don't you forget it. Essentially, the premise of this whole practice is that you take certain elements from the Beatles' separate solo albums. You take bits of a John Lennon album, a George Harrison album, a Paul McCartney album, and a Ringo Starr album. You put them together into a sort of crock-pot collection of select tracks, and bada bing, bada boom, you got a Beatles album there. So what really got me started on this journey was reading a book by Jeff Walker called Let's Put the Beatles Back Together Again, 1970 to 2010, which is an interesting read if you're a Beatles fanatic like me, and I do recommend you at least check it out. But what happens in this book is he puts together an alternate timeline wherein the Beatles don't split apart in 1969. They just sort of deal with their intergroup squabblings and continue on by rebranding themselves as the Beatles Recording Collective, which just rolls right off the tongue, and release their following albums as box sets, which come out almost every decade, essentially becoming a songwriting collective of 4 individual artists. Which, while a good foundation for an idea of where the Beatles would have gone had they not split up, I think is asking a lot of disbelief on the part of the audience, particularly the 2 bits of rebranding themselves under a really convoluted name, and also the idea that the albums they would have put out after Abbey Road would have been all box sets and would have come out almost 10 years of each other. I'm sorry, but that's not how the music business works. No one, not even the Beatles, would have been tolerated for practicing that. No label would have ever signed onto them. No one would have been able to afford a 3-record set, like deluxe package in the 1970s and then another one in the 80s. That's an impossible thing to ask of anyone, especially if it's the Beatles. It wouldn't have mattered, you know. Any artist doing that incessantly would get obnoxious. On the other end of that token, we have a YouTuber like Thinking of Linking 17, whose link, and I will put in an annotation at the bottom of the screen, right here. He actually helped me sort of get more towards what I went for with my solo Beatle albums. But at the same time, I think he took the other extreme, which is he put on every single song that they put on either a solo album or a single onto fake Beatle albums, which I think is a bit of an oversaturation there, because you had to leave some songs out so they can go on the Beatles' solo albums, because they would still have solo albums. Any artist would still have solo albums, even with the whole wealth of material. You know, you can't just oversaturate it by putting every single thing that they would have put out on an album onto different individual pieces. You know, they're not Elvis Presley. They didn't wear us out with too much. No one ever said, that's too much, Beatles. You need to give us less music. Their most successful album is the White Album, and that's the record with the most songs on it. So, you know. The Beatles even put out an EP on iTunes briefly in 2014, which was a 4-song collection of solo tracks, in essence making a sampler of what I'm going to make this video about, which is my solo Beatles albums. Now, I sort of lie in the middle between Thinking of Lincoln 17 and Jeff Walker's Beatles Recording Collective. The way I sort of structured my albums was that I chose to select tracks from albums that came out during eras when the actual Beatles would collaborate with each other. Now, what does that mean? Well, ironically enough, even after the Beatles split apart, they kept playing on each other's records, with the exception being Paul McCartney. No one would play with Paul McCartney until the 80s, when they finally got over their issues with him. But with John, George, and Ringo, all 3 of them kept playing on each other's records. So, in essence, that was how I decided when I would put together a Beatles album. Anytime that a Beatle would play on another ex-Beatles solo album, that would facilitate me creating a fake Beatles album out of what the 4 of them were doing at that space and time, because it showed willingness to put the band back together, as it were. So, for example, George Harrison plays slide guitar on a lot of John Lennon's Imagine album from 1971, thus facilitating a 1971 Beatles album that combines elements of Imagine, All Things Must Pass, Ram, and Beaucoups of Blues. It just felt the most correct. As a side note, I'm going to leave links to Spotify playlists I've made for these albums in the description. So if you want to hear them for yourself, go ahead and click on those and you should be taken straight to them. But before we begin, let's talk about the one little factoid. Let it be. All of my contemporaries, whether it's Jeff Walker, Thinking of Lincoln 17, or maybe even Ethan Hawke, all agree that the main contingent to make these fake Beatles albums work is to address the pink elephant in the room, which is Let It Be. Now, obviously, this is the official last album, but it was recorded before Abbey Road, which means that we must look more towards what this was originally going to be, which was a 1969 album produced by Glyn Johns called Get Back. Now, having listened to both the Glyn Johns version of this album and the Phil Spector version, I can't agree with people that Glenn Johns' mix is superior. Not to say that it redeems the Phil Spector version of that record, because it doesn't. Phil Spector did destroy Long and Winding Road and Across the Universe and I Me Mine and Let It Be with his Wall of Sound production. These songs were not built to withstand the Wall of Sound production. They were meant to be a return to the Beatles' recording roots. But at the same time, Glenn Johns made a lot of really poor decisions when it came to choosing the best takes. Because he wanted to make a documentary feel to the album, he chose a lot of rehearsals and half-finished versions of tracks, and that is insane to think that any artist would have put out that as a legitimate studio album. Of course the Beatles rejected it. They had standards. So my version of Get Back is a sort of blend between the Phil Spector version and the Glenn Johns version. It sort of maintains the structure of the Glenn Johns mix, which means that a lot of times songs are stripped down and put to their essentials, but at the same time, I don't use any of the rehearsals or half-finished takes that Glenn Johns used. Because, ironically enough, for as much as people complained that Spector ruined the album with his Wall of Sound production, he only uses it on a handful of tracks. A lot of songs on Let It Be are left to stand as is. Two of Us is left pretty much untouched. Dig a Pony's left pretty much untouched. Maggie May is left untouched. I've Got a Feeling's left untouched. One After 909, For You Blue, and Get Back are all essentially left as is, as the studio performances that were meant to be a return to the Beatles' roots. It's just a select tracks that kind of got ruined because Spector likes to put strings on a lot of things. So in those situations, whenever there was a Spector track that was pretty much just what it was supposed to be, a return to the Beatles' roots, I leave that as the official version. I kept the excised portions of Dig a Pony on the original one, which you can find on bootlegs of the rooftop performance, and I did remove the strings off of Let It Be, Across the Universe, I Me Mine, and Long and Winding Road. With those tracks, I decided to, number one, Get Back and Let It Be use the single versions produced by George Martin. Across the Universe and I Me Mine are used by using the Let It Be Renaked remixes from 2003, and Long and Winding Road is given its own personal remix that Jeff Walker talks about in his book, which is essentially you use the basic track of the Let It Be remix, but then you use the middle 8 from Anthology 3. And with the Let It Be album out of the way, let's start talking about our alternate Beatles discography after Abbey Road. Abbey Road was such a pristine album, probably the most immaculately produced record in the whole Beatles catalog up to that point. But at the same time, it was becoming clear that this was a direction that they did not want to go towards. Plus, it was becoming clear that the group dynamic of focusing mostly on John Lennon and Paul McCartney was no longer working, as George and Ringo were now bringing more important songs to the forefront than they had in the early years of the Beatles, which would have contrasted greatly with George Martin's view of the Beatles as a John and Paul-centric unit. So then 1970 gives us John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Beatles. A collection of tracks from Plastic Ono Band, McCartney, the first half of All Things Must Pass, and nothing from Sentimental Journey because where the hell would standards have fit in on this choice of material? This essentially begins a new phase in the Beatles' recording career, which is they decide to go for a more stripped-back approach and start to go lyrically for more domestic terms, essentially turning in a singer-songwriter album. The same way Carole King, James Taylor, and Joni Mitchell all put out singer-songwriters albums at the same time, the Beatles went for that route. John's songs are introspective, Paul's songs are introspective, and George's songs are introspective. They also decide to go for a more minimalist production, with a lot of stray ends being left on the record. Excepting, of course, George Harrison's tracks from All Things Must Pass, because Spector was heavily involved with his record, and not so much John's record. So, thus, George's songs have the kind of Phil Spector polish to them. George Martin is not attached to this album. The official producer I list on the back cover of my record of this is Phil Spector. If you really look at it, John and George all went to work for Spector immediately following Abbey Road, so it's pretty conceivable that Spector would have became their next producer following Abbey Road. 1971, the Beatles' Imagine. This is a selection of tracks from Imagine, Ram, the second half of All Things Must Pass, and the title track of Bukus of Blues. This follows on around the same formula as the 1970 Beatles album, but adds some more Spector-esque production. Spector is more heavily involved, thus we see the arrival of more strings, more echo, more reverb, more detailed production, and all in all, this creates a very warm-sounding record. It's interesting to hear the Beatles produced by Phil Spector, especially because they're working with a producer who they had known for a while, but at the same time had produced a lot of tracks that they themselves were heavily influenced by. They had the Ronettes tour with them in 1966. They'd even covered To Know Him Is to Love Him during their early years at the Cavern. Of course, changing the title around to Know Her Is to Love Her, but, you know, of course. We also see some verbal spading going on between the Beatles during this time. John references in God that he doesn't believe in Beatles, and Paul's Too Many People is a direct slap in the face towards John Lennon. But at the same time, with tracks like All Things Must Pass and Isn't It a Pity, the Beatles album and the Imagine album are really just life-affirming in a way. These two albums deal with darker themes than most Beatles albums do. They deal with love in the same way that they did in the 60s, but at the same time it's a more realistic love. It's love that's born out of pain and anger and frustration, but also finds peace in domesticity on the farm or in just the warm comforts of home. Or spirituality. They look for spirituality with messages to God and, you know, probably the greatest Christian rock you'll ever hear in your life. Thank you, George Harrison. You weren't even Christian. 1972 gives us Sometime in New York City. This is a collection of songs from Sometime in New York City, Wings Wildlife, and the George Harrison Bangladesh single. This is where the formula starts to wear thin. This may actually be the first Beatles album to be average. Well, not the first one to be average. Beatles for Sale is kind of meh. And also, Yellow Submarine is not even an album. That's an EP of outtakes that the Beatles felt weren't good enough for Sgt. Pepper or Magical Mystery Tour. Phil Spector produces this one again, though at the same time his production is very limited as he starts to become pretty inefficient as a producer. I mean, the man's in jail now for murdering a girl in L.A., so he had already had problems dating all the way back to the 1960s. He starts to wear out the Beatles. Also, too, this album doesn't necessarily meet audience demand, because unlike Imagine and Beatles, which focused more on introspective singer-songwriting, John Lennon starts pushing forward the Beatles to become much more political folk maestros like Bob Dylan, which is reflected in the original Sometime in New York City album that John Lennon put out in 1972 and what this is based off of. So what does that mean for the Beatles? Well, it means that you get a lot of political songs like Woman is the of the World, New York City, John Sinclair, and even from Paul and George with the Bangladesh song from George and Paul's Give Ireland Back to the Irish. This is also where Spotify starts to screw things up because some of the songs are not available on the site, so please forgive it for not having this whole selection. It did not know I was going to do this. But at the same time, with George and Paul, they weren't going to sacrifice their pop songwriting just so they could become, you know, political songwriting troubadours for John's concept that he had in his head. George doesn't have a lot of material around this time, his lone other contributions being Deep Blue and one of the jams from the All Things Must Pass sessions, Thanks for the Pepperoni. Paul McCartney, as well, sort of wants to stick with his themes of domesticity and country life on the farm with Linda, but his songwriting is really going off the beaten track. Ridiculous filler like a Bit Bop and Some People Never Know really detract this album from being on the same level as Imagine and Beatles. It was clear by this point that something was not working with the formula that they had established, and they needed to create a different sound, or at the very least return to something that had been working out very well in the late 60s. Also, it was becoming clear that they were getting to the end of their rope with Phil Spector, who really sort of did them wrong on this album. His production style was not really meshing with their songwriting, and even then he took a sort of restrained distance on producing this album than he had on Imagine or on the Beatles record. Thus we reach 1973's deluxe box set double album of Black Box. Now, a lot of context is needed for this record. First off, this is the very first album that is self-produced by the Beatles. This album doesn't have a producer on it. The credited producer I gave was John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, because aside from Ringo, all three of them self-produced their albums in 1973, thus making this a self-produced Beatles album. There's also a switch in the sound of the record due to them gaining influence from what was the major pop influence, at least in Britain at that time, which was glam rock. This is the start of the Beatles glam rock era, with the major influences being David Bowie, Elton John, and T-Rex. The same way that in 1965 they were influenced by Bob Dylan to make an album like Rubber Soul, or in 1967 they were influenced by the Beach Boys to create Sgt. Pepper. The Beatles were always sort of representative of their time in the 60s. Even though their music is still timeless, they always were sort of listening to what other people were around them were doing. They were heavily influenced by their contemporaries, and how could they not be? They were artists who always wanted to be on top of what was happening with their culture. So thus, in the mid-70s, we got the glam rock scene happening. Alice Cooper, and previously mentioned David Bowie, Elton John, and T-Rex, Queen was coming out at the same time too, and they were sort of taking a harder-edged glam thing. Glam was what was happening with pop music, at least in the mid-70s in Britain. So the four of them, with hesitations from George, who had said in interviews that he really had a distaste for the glam rock scene, viewing it as ridiculous.
Now, I can't get on with that scene. I just met David Bowie, who they call Bowie in America, David Bowie. Every picture I've ever seen of David Bowie or Elton John, they just look stupid to me. I thought they looked great. Well, I think he looks dopey.
But anyway, we have here the 73 album Black Box, a collection of tracks from Mind Games, Red Rose Speedway, Living in a Material World, and Ringo's 1973 self-titled album. Housed in a black box set and featuring tons of colorful imagery on separate sleeves for the albums and a big full-length poster a la the White Album. This is a sort of return to form for the Beatles as they return to the sound of Abbey Road. We have a long medley of short songs to finish off the album. Plus, it also follows up sort of from where the White Album left off, with a lot of songs being very varied in their style and tone and subject matter. I'm going to close these blinds because the sun is shining in my face. Combining the scope of the White Album with the top-notch production and performance of Abbey Road, we have possibly one of the most immaculately produced Beatles albums ever made. And one of their most successful, too. At least 4 #1 hit singles are pulled off of this album. Photograph, My Love, Give Me Peace on Earth, You're 16. This was essentially a return to form for the Beatles. In fact, it almost triggered off a second wave of Beatlemania, coming out at the same time as the Red and Blue albums and the Green one. I'm not going to talk about that. This sort of signaled a return to form for the Beatles after the disappointing Sometime in New York City. And also, too, with Imagine and Beatles being decent albums, but not really seeming almost nihilistic to the generation that grew up with them in the 60s, this was a return to form. The themes of love and happiness and peace and God are referenced all over this. It's tough to really say what makes this album so fantastic. I think probably because it's the Beatles returning to their strengths and trying to actually create a Beatle album like they used to, and on their own terms, and with their own sound. I actually think it's fascinating that this is a self-produced album, because what that means is that you're hearing for the first time what the Beatles actually want their sound to be like without any filter whatsoever. Because let's face it, even with them sort of learning knowledge of the tools in the later years, they were still having to be filtered through George Martin. Now there's no filter. The producer is the Beatles. You're getting the sound that the Beatles want you to hear directly from the horse's mouth. That is just captivating on its own. So 1973's Black Box is followed up in 1974 by Band on the Run, a collection of songs from Paul's Band on the Run, John's Walls and Bridges, Ringo's Goodnight Vienna, and the title track off of George's Dark Horse album. Unfortunately, George takes a smaller role in this album as opposed to Black Box because during recording sessions for the album, he contracts laryngitis. So thus he doesn't sing a lot on this album. He really sings through guitar work on the record. Again, much like Imagine followed the same sort of formula as the Beatles album in 1970, Band on the Run is a sort of more concise, focused, streamlined version of Black Box. It's not as wide-ranging, but it sort of retains the same pop perfection sound. It's also, once again, produced by the Beatles. With the 1-2 punch knockout of Band on the Run and Black Box, you would think that this would be the time that the Beatles were on top of the world. And yet, the Band on the Run sort of represents the ending of the golden age of the Beatles. Namely, their prime years, which to me are Please Please Me up to now with Band on the Run. These peak years end after 1974, unfortunately. It's actually bizarre. What I found in my studies was that the Beatles actually end up a lot like the Rolling Stones, where they just sort of create decent albums up to now, but with their golden age being long behind them. Except, surprisingly, the Beatles' golden age ended before the Stones. The Stones at least keep their golden age running at least into the 80s, or at least 81 with Tattoo You. But the Beatles sort of start to reach their decline after Band on the Run. Starting off with the long wait between Band on the Run and its 1976 follow-up, Beatles at the Speed of Sound. The four members take 1975 off, all deciding to focus on different projects. John goes off to make his rock and roll album. Paul makes Venus and Mars under the guise of his band Wings. George creates Extra Texture, and Ringo just parties it up with Keith Moon and Harry Nilsson. But the problem is, because of the wait that people had to endure, and because of the Beatles taking a year off, something crucial happens that determines the rest of the future for the Beatles and our fake albums. John Lennon decides to retire from the music business. He leaves sessions for Beatles at the Speed of Sound very early into production, only contributing to Ringo's Cooking in the Kitchen of Love, which John wrote, and supplying a demo version of Mucho Mungo, which is then given added string arrangements, which were written by me. This is a collection of songs from Paul's Wings at the Speed of Sound, George's 33 1/3, and Ringo's Roto Guaver, with some selected John Lennon bits being added here and there. Paul dominates the album, having 4 songs total, but even those are painfully slight, with Let 'Em In, Silly Love Songs, barely even qualifying as songs, yet with Silly Love Songs still reaching number 1 on the top of the charts, so Because of John's lessened presence, though, on this record, it inevitably falls short of where Band on the Run and Black Box had been. Also, the Beatles have sort of forsaken the glam rock sound. They have gone away from it and have moved more towards a softer rock kind of sound, specifically citing Paul and George and even John's songwriting contributions with Mucho Mango and Cooking in the Kitchen of Love. They're moving more towards their late 30s, and because of that, the material is sounding more and more adult-themed, which is inevitable. Any artist would be writing about adult themes as they reach adulthood, but youth is the name of the game in pop music, and so for the Beatles to start to sound their age is kind of disheartening. The world would have to wait a full 4 years for the next Beatles album to be given onto the world, during which time disco, punk, new wave, and many other developments happened within the pop music scene. Paul decides to go off and keep recording stuff with Wings. George founds the Dark Horse label and creates a solo album of his own in 1979, George Harrison. Ringo goes on to make 2 more solo albums, Ringo the Fourth and Bad Boy, both of which are given very poor reviews because Ringo is not a very good solo artist and continues to party like mad as part of the Hollywood Vampires. John retires from the music business into domesticity and spends the next 5 years raising his son, Sean Lennon. When the Beatles return in 1980, a lot has changed, and their style and influence has changed too. 1980, at which point the Beatles release Double Fantasy, particularly now receiving a lot of influence from the new wave scene. John particularly being influenced by the B-52s, and Paul being influenced by synth pop, at least early synth pop. This is also a John and Paul dominated record, as the songs are called from John's Double Fantasy and Paul's McCartney 2, with George and Ringo not releasing anything in 1980, thus they're not being material for them on Double Fantasy. So essentially, this album follows the same structure as John's Double Fantasy album. It's a song from John, and Yoko's replaced with Paul. The world rejoices. This would have been a very bizarre way for the Beatles to come back into the public consciousness, especially because they're now writing for their age. At least John is, and he makes no apologies about this. His songs, Watching the Wheels, Just Like Starting Over, Beautiful Boy, Clean Up Time, Dear Yoko, all of these are very specifically about one thing, which is John now being 40 years old and being a parent, and they are singing to the adult generation of the 60s, which is very fascinating in its own right, and it would have been fascinating to see where the foursome would have ended up. But unfortunately, we all know that's not what happened. Double Fantasy ends up being the last album that the Beatles will release in John Lennon's lifetime, with John tragically being murdered in 1980 in front of the steps of his Dakota apartment. Now, feel free to disagree with me on the rest of this video, because I can see why some will say this is where the Beatles should end. Because even in a fake timeline, we could not see them continuing on without John Lennon. And I can totally see where you're coming from there. So, but at the same time, I'm too curious to see what would have happened had they kept going up to now, so here's what they do post John Lennon. They reunite with George Martin in 1982 to create an album called Moondogs. The songs are called from John's Milk and Honey, Paul's Tug of War, George's Somewhere in England, and Ringo's Stop and Take the Time to Smell the Roses. This is built up around unfinished songs that John would have already recorded for the follow-up to Double Fantasy, plus newly written and recorded material from Paul, George, and Ringo. George Martin has returned after not producing the Beatles since 1969, and it sounds like a very classicist Beatles album. This is sort of a return to their 60s roots. In fact, it almost feels like this was an album made with the intention of trying to go back to the sound of the Beatles of the 1960s. George is given only 2 songs, Ringo's given only 2 songs. Paul dominates a lot of the album, with John's tracks being reflective of where they were on Double Fantasy. This will be the last album to feature the original lineup up to 1998, but we will reach that point when we come to it. Moondogs ends up being a surprise success, turning in a #1 single with Ebony and Ivory, a collaboration done with Stevie Wonder. So, With trepidation, the Beatles decided to go into the studio one more time, this time as a trio, and again with George Martin, to see what the results were. 1983 gives us the very sad, very mediocre Old Wave. Culled from Paul's Pipes of Peace, George Harrison's Gone Troppo, and Ringo Starr's Old Wave album, this is probably the worst album in the Beatles' catalog. Which is not to say that it's totally bad, it's just very mediocre. Paul doesn't have a very strong impact on the album. Not to say that his stuff on Pipes of Peace was not necessarily good, but at the same time it didn't necessarily fit into the mold of Beatle albums. George's songs feel tossed off and unfinished, much as they do on the Gone Troppo album, and Ringo's songs are also performed very poorly, and it just seems like this is an album made without direction. The three of them don't know where to go. Now that John's no longer there, and they aren't really sure if they should even be recording as a trio anyway, they produce an album that, even with George Martin's production, is pretty hard to listen to. It only goes on for a half hour, but that half hour feels like an eternity. I actually did statistics to see how these albums would have sold by combining the figures of each of the solo albums together. With Black Box being their most successful post-Abbey Road album, this is undoubtedly their least successful album in their whole catalog. It sold very poorly, critical reception would have been very poor, and this really convinces the Beatles, we need to step aside. It seems pretty much at this point that the Beatles are over. George goes off to produce films with Handmade Films. Paul makes a very disappointing movie and a very disappointing album. And Ringo just goes off and tries to recover from his rampant alcoholism. The Beatles would not return to the studio to create an album again until 1989, whereupon the world received Cloud 9, widely regarded as another comeback for the Beatles, or at least the Threedles, as it were now. This album is collected from George's Cloud 9 and Paul's Flowers in the Dirt. Ringo not releasing anything during this time period means that once again he is not on the record, and this means also that we have a sort of recurring theme now of a record following along the formula of double fantasy. Jeff Lynne has now stepped in as the producer, with them exchanging George Martin with ELO's Jeff Lynne, which is a very fitting choice, as perhaps they needed a younger hand to keep them up to date with what was happening in the 80s. And Jeff Lynne is a perfect choice to produce the Beatles because he's been trying to produce the Beatles in his own music since he began. So this was a fine choice and made perfect sense. And it worked too, it paid off, because this album would produce the Beatles' final #1 single, Got My Mind Set on You, and pretty much brought them back into commercial appeal. And yet the Beatles decided not to act upon this. They would not release another album again until 1998, after finishing production on Anthology and producing 2 new reunion singles in the span of the 1990s. The Beatles only put out 1 album in the 90s, and it is 1998's Free as a Bird. This essentially is built up of the Free as a Bird and Real Love singles from the Anthology project, selections from Paul's Flaming Pie, George's Brainwashed, and Ringo's Vertical Man. Jeff Lynne returns as producer, and this is once again another comeback album. You will hear that for the rest of this video. This is the only Beatles album of the 1990s, and while that is a shame, at the same time, it's very fitting. If they were going to put out only 1 album of the 90s, this should have been the one they made. This is also, unfortunately, the last album we have with George Harrison. His contributions to the record are Any Road and Rising Sun and the instrumental Marwa Blues. This is probably as good as it gets for later day Beatles, or at least post-John Lennon Beatles. After George Harrison's death in 2001, the Beatles are pretty much put on a hiatus. They take the whole 2000s off and don't return into the studio again until 2009, whereupon they record 2010's Singularity. The album is built off of selections from Paul's album with the Firemen, Electric Arguments, and Ringo's album, Why Not. Now they have been reduced to only a rhythm section. We have Paul and Ringo. While it would have probably made more sense to build off Paul's selections from Memory Almost Full, the album he had put out in 2007, I felt it made more sense to go with his record with the Firemen because that record takes a few more chances and would have been a much more fascinating listen. It's a decent enough album. It sounds very much like how you would expect modern-day Beatles to sound, essentially. Youth has now stepped in as producer, as this album was originally started off as a Fireman project before evolving into a new Beatle album. There's not much to be said about this record. It's Paul and Ringo under the name of the Beatles. It sounds like you would probably expect it to sound. If you want to know what that sound is like, go ahead, Spotify playlists down below. And as for now, that is where the Beatles have left us. So far, Paul and Ringo have not collaborated on any of their solo albums since 2010's Why Not from Ringo, where Paul duetted with him on Walk With You. So should there come a time where Paul and Ringo collaborate again on either a Paul album or a Ringo album, that will facilitate, as far as I'm concerned, another fake Beatles album, at which point I will let you know what that is, and what it looks like, and what it sounds like. So I hope at the very least what this is showed you a sort of alternate history. Now, of course this is all speculation. There's no guarantee that this is what they would have produced, and at the same time, that's not the point of this. The point of this, honestly, is just to have fun with imagining what would the Beatles have done had they not broken up, and what sounds would they have produced, and where would they have gone from here. I think it's also good as a sampler of their solo careers because there's a lot of material, and even as a super freak, I'm not rushing out to get Ringo albums all the time. So I hope this was an interesting experiment. I hope you got something from this. Leave a comment below if you agree, disagree, have your own opinion, and let me know what you think. And also let me know what you think of me doing music-centric videos like this, because obviously this is a new thing. I haven't done a lot of this before, and who knows if I will do things like it again in the future. Only time will tell. So that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you next week for a new Fanfiction String Names episode. Take care.